Welcome to the library. Today's story is The Chain of Aforgomon, published in 1935 by Clark Ashton Smith, one of the big three of the golden age of Weird Tales magazine, alongside Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft. No introduction needed for them, I suppose. This story introduces a terrifying cosmic god of time named Aforgomon, an entity that horror scholars widely consider to be an alternate avatar of Lovecraft's famous monster, Yog-Sothoth. Smith and Lovecraft were actually close pen pals who loved to borrow from each other's fictional universes, so I wouldn't be surprised. Now, without further ado, let's begin. It is indeed strange that John Milwarp and his writings should have fallen so speedily into semi-oblivion. His books, treating of Oriental life in a somewhat flowery, romantic style, were popular a few months ago. But now, in spite of their range and penetration, their pervasive verbal sorcery, they are seldom mentioned, and they seem to have vanished unaccountably from the shelves of bookstores and libraries. Even the mystery of Milwarp's death, baffling to both law and science, has evoked but a passing interest, an excitement quickly lulled and forgotten. I was well acquainted with Milwarp over a term of years, but my recollection of the man is becoming strangely blurred, like an image in a misted mirror. His dark, half-alien personality, his preoccupation with the occult, his immense knowledge of Eastern life and lore are things I remember with such effort and vagueness as attends the recovery of a dream. Sometimes I almost doubt that he ever existed. It is as if the man and all that pertains to him were being erased from human record by some mysterious acceleration of the common process of obliteration. In his will, he appointed me his executor. I have vainly tried to interest publishers in the novel he left among his papers, a novel surely not inferior to anything he ever wrote. They say that his vogue has passed. Now, I am publishing as a magazine story the contents of the diary kept by Milwarp for a period preceding his demise. Perhaps, for the open-minded, this diary will explain the enigma of his death. It would seem that the circumstances of that death are virtually forgotten, and I repeat them here as part of my endeavor to revive and perpetuate Milwarp's memory. Milwarp had returned to his house in San Francisco after a long sojourn in Indochina. We who knew him gathered that he had gone into places seldom visited by Occidentals. At the time of his demise, he had just finished correcting the typescript of a novel that dealt with the more romantic and mysterious aspects of Burma. On the morning of April 2nd, 1933, his housekeeper, a middle-aged woman, was startled by a glare of brilliant light which issued from the half-open door of Milwarp's study. It was as if the whole room were in flames. Horrified, the woman hastened to investigate. Entering the study, she saw her master sitting in an armchair at the table, wearing the rich, somber robes of Chinese brocade which he affected as a dressing gown. He sat stiffly erect, a pen clutched unmoving in his fingers on the open pages of a manuscript volume. About him, in a sort of nimbus, glowed and flickered the strange light, and her only thought was that his garments were on fire. She ran toward him, crying out a warning. At that moment, the weird nimbus brightened intolerably, and the wan early dayshine, the electric bulbs that still burned to attest the night's labor, were alike blotted out. It seemed to the housekeeper that something had gone wrong with the room itself, for the walls and table vanished, and a great luminous gulf opened before her, and on the verge of the gulf, in a seat that was not his cushioned armchair, but a huge and rough-hewn seat of stone, she beheld her master, stark and rigid. His heavy brocaded robes were gone, and about him, from head to foot, were blinding coils of pure white fire in the form of linked chains. She could not endure the brilliance of the chains, and cowering back, she shielded her eyes with her hands. When she dared to look again, the weird glowing had faded. The room was as usual, and Milwarp's motionless figure was seated at the table in the posture of writing. Shaken and terrified as she was, the woman found courage to approach her master. A hideous smell of burnt flesh arose from beneath her garments, which were wholly intact and without visible trace of fire. He was dead, his fingers clenched on the pen, and his features frozen in a stare of titanic agony. His neck and wrists were completely encircled by frightful burns that had charred them deeply. The coroner, in his examination, found that these burns, preserving an outline as of heavy links, were extended in long, unbroken spirals around the arms and legs and torso. The burning was apparently the cause of Milwarp's death. It was as if iron chains, heated to incandescence, had been wrapped about him. Little credit was given to the housekeeper's story of what she had seen. No one, however, could suggest an acceptable explanation of the bizarre mystery. There was, at the time, much aimless discussion, but, as I have hinted, people soon turned to other matters. The efforts made to solve the riddle were somewhat perfunctory. Chemists tried to determine the nature of a queer drug in the form of a gray powder with pearly granules, to whose use Milwarp had become addicted. But their tests merely revealed the presence of an alkaloid whose source and attributes were obscure to Western science. Day by day, the whole incredible business lapsed from public attention, and those who had known Milwarp began to display the forgetfulness that was no less unaccountable than his weird doom. The housekeeper, who had held steadfastly in the beginning to her story, came at length to share the common dubiety. Her account, with repetition, became vague and contradictory. Detail by detail, she seemed to forget the abnormal circumstances that she had witnessed with overwhelming horror. The manuscript volume in which Milwarp had apparently been writing at the time of death was given into my charge with his other papers. It proved to be a diary, its last entry breaking off abruptly. Since reading the diary, I have hastened to transcribe it in my own hand, because, for some mysterious reason, the ink of the original is already fading and has become almost illegible in places. The reader will note certain lacunae, due to passages written in an alphabet, which neither I nor any scholar of my acquaintance can transliterate. These passages seem to form an integral part of the narrative, and they occur mainly toward the end, as if the writer had turned more and more to a language remembered from his ancient avatar. To the same mental reversion, one must attribute the singular dating, in which Milwarp, still employing English script, appears to pass from our contemporary notation to that of some pre-mundane world. I give hereunder the entire diary, which begins with an undated footnote. This book, unless I have been misinformed concerning the qualities of the drug Suvara, will be the record of my former life in a lost cycle. I have had the drug in my possession for 7 months, but fear has prevented me from using it. Now, by certain tokens, I perceive that the longing for knowledge will soon overcome the fear. Ever since my earliest childhood, I have been troubled by intimations, dim, unplaceable, that seem to argue a forgotten existence. These intimations partook of the nature of feelings rather than ideas or images. They were like the wraiths of dead memories. In the background of my mind, there has lurked a sentiment of formless, melancholy desire for some nameless beauty long perished out of time. And coincidentally, I have been haunted by an equally formless dread, an apprehension as of some bygone but still imminent doom. Such feelings have persisted, undiminished, throughout my youth and maturity, but nowhere have I found any clue to their causation. My travels in the mystic Orient, my delvings into occultism, have merely convinced me that these shadowy intuitions pertain to some incarnation buried under the wreck of remotest cycles. Many times in my wanderings through Buddhistic lands, I had heard of the drug suvara, which is believed to restore, even for the uninitiate, the memory of other lives. And at last, after many vain efforts, I managed to procure a supply of the drug. The manner in which I obtained it is a tale sufficiently remarkable in itself, but of no special relevance here. So far, perhaps because of that apprehension which I have hinted at, I have not dared to use the drug. March 9th, 1933. This morning I took swavara for the first time, dissolving the proper amount in pure distilled water as I had been instructed to do. Afterward, I leaned back easily in my chair, breathing with a slow, regular rhythm. I had no preconceived idea of the sensations that would mark the drug's initial effect, since these were said to vary prodigiously with the temperament of the users. But I composed myself to await them with tranquility, after formulating clearly in my mind the purpose of the experiment. For a while there was no change in my awareness. I noticed a slight quickening of the pulse and modulated my breathing in conformity with this. Then, by slow degrees, I experienced a sharpening of visual perception. The Chinese rugs on the floor, the backs of the serried volumes in my bookcases, the very wood of chairs, table, and shelves began to exhibit new and unimagined colors. At the same time, there were curious alterations of outline, every object seeming to extend itself in a hitherto unsuspected fashion. Following this, my surroundings became semi-transparent, like molded shapes of mist. I found that I could see through the marbled cover the illustrations in a volume of John Martin's edition of Paradise Lost, which lay before me on the table. All this I knew was a mere extension of ordinary physical vision. It was only a prelude to those apperceptions of occult realms which I sought through Suvada. Fixing my mind once more on the goal of the experiment, I became aware that the misty walls had vanished like a drawn arras. About me, like reflections in rippled water, dim sceneries wavered and shifted, erasing one another from instant to instant. I seemed to hear a vague but ever-present sound, more musical than the murmurs of air, water, or fire, which was a property of the unknown element that environed me. With a sense of troublous familiarity, I beheld the blurred, unstable pictures which flowed past me upon this never-resting medium. Orient temples, flashing with sun-struck bronze and gold, the sharp, crowded gables and spires of medieval cities, tropic and northern forests, the costumes and physiognomies of the Levant, of Persia, of old Rome and Carthage, went by like blown, flying mirages. Each succeeding tableau belonged to a more ancient period than the one before it, and I knew that each was a scene from some former existence of my own. Still tethered, as it were, to my present self, I reviewed these visible memories, which took on tri-dimensional depth and clarity. I saw myself as warrior and troubadour, as noble and merchant and mendicant. I trembled with dead fears. I thrilled with lost hopes and raptures, and was drawn by ties that death and Lethe had broken. Yet never did I fully identify myself with those other avatars, for I knew well that the memory I sought pertained to some incarnation of older epochs. Still, the phantasmagoria streamed on, and I turned giddy with vertigo ineffable before the vastness and dieternity of the cycles of being. It seemed that I, the watcher, was lost in a gray land where the homeless ghosts of all dead ages went fleeing from oblivion to oblivion. The walls of Nineveh, the columns and towers of unnamed cities rose before me and were swept away. I saw the luxuriant plains that are now the Gobi Desert. The sea-lost capitals of Atlantis were drawn to the light in unquenched glory. I gazed on lush and cloudy scenes from the first continents of earth. Briefly, I relived the beginnings of terrestrial man, and knew that the secret I would learn was ancienter even than these. My visions faded into black voidness, and yet, in that void, through fathomless eons, it seemed that I existed still, like a blind atom in the space between the worlds. About me was the darkness and repose of that night which antedated the earth's creation. Time flowed backward with the silence of dreamless sleep. The illumination, when it came, was instant and complete. I stood in the full, fervid blaze of day amid royally towering blossoms in a deep garden, beyond whose lofty, vine-clad walls I heard the confused murmuring of the great city called Kalud. Above me, at their vernal zenith, were the 4 small suns that illumined the planet Heston. Jewel-colored insects fluttered about me, lighting without fear on the rich habiliments of gold and black, and wrought with astronomic symbols in which I was attired. Beside me was a dial-shaped altar of zoned agate, carved with the same symbols, which were those of the dreadful omnipotent time god, Aforgomon, whom I served as a priest. I had not even the slightest memory of myself as John Milwarp, and the long pageant of my terrestrial lives was as something that had never been, or was yet to be. Sorrow and desolation choked my heart as ashes fill some urn consecrated to the dead, and all the hues and perfumes of the garden about me were redolent only of the bitterness of death. Gazing darkly upon the altar, I muttered blasphemy against Aforgomon, who, in his inexorable course, had taken away my beloved, and had sent no solace for my grief. Separately, I cursed the signs upon the altar, the stars, the worlds, the suns, the moons that meted and fulfilled the processes of time. Belthorus, my betrothed, had died at the end of the previous autumn, and so, with double maledictions, I cursed the stars and planets presiding over that season. I became aware that a shadow had fallen beside my own on the altar, and knew that the dark sage and sorcerer Atmox had obeyed my summons. Fearfully, but not without hope, I turned toward him, noting first of all that he bore under his arm a heavy, sinister-looking volume with covers of black steel and hasps of adamant. Only when I had made sure of this did I lift my eyes to his face, which was little less somber and forbidding than the tome he carried. "Greeting, O Kalaspa," he said harshly. "I have come against my own will and judgment. The lore that you request is in this volume, and since you saved me in former years from the inquisitorial wrath of the time god's priests, I cannot refuse to share it with you. But understand well that even I,
who have called upon names that are dreadful to utter, and have evoked forbidden presences, shall never dare to assist you in this conjuration. Gladly would I help you to hold converse with the shadow of Belthoris, or to animate her still unwithered body and draw it forth from the tomb. But that which you propose is another matter. You alone must perform the ordained rites, must speak the necessary words, for the consequences of this thing will be direr than you deem."
"I care not for the consequences," I replied eagerly, "if it be possible to bring back the lost hours which I shared with Belthoris. Think you that I could content myself with her shadow, wandering thinly back from the borderland? Or that I could take pleasure in the fair clay that the breath of necromancy has troubled and has made to arise and walk without mind or soul? Nay, the Belthoris I would summon is she on whom the shadow of death has never yet fallen." It seemed that Atmox, the master of doubtful arts, the vassal of umbrageous powers, recoiled and blenched before my vehement declaration. "Bethink you," he said with minatory sternness, "that this thing will constitute a breach of the sacred logic of time, and the blasphemy against Aforgomon, god of the minutes and the cycles. Moreover, there is little to be gained, for not in its entirety may you bring back the season of your love, but only one single hour, torn with infinite violence from its rightful period in time. Refrain, I adjure you, and content yourself with a lesser sorcery." "Give me the book," I demanded. "My service to Aforgomon is forfeit. With due reverence and devotion I have worshipped the time god, and have done in his honor the rites ordained from eternity. And for all this, the god has betrayed me."
Then, in that high-climbing, luxuriant garden beneath the four suns, Atmox opened the adamantine clasps of the steel-bound volume, and, turning to a certain page, he laid the book reluctantly in my hands. The page, like its fellows, was of some unholy parchment streaked with musty discolorations and blackening at the margin with sheer antiquity. But upon it shone unquenchably the dread characters a primal age had written with an ink bright as the new-shed ichor of demons. Above this page I bent in my madness, conning it over and over till I was dazzled by the fiery runes, and shutting my eyes I saw them burn on a red darkness, still legible and writhing like hellish worms. Hollowly, like the sound of a far bell, I heard the voice of Atmox. "You have learned, O Calaspa, the unutterable name of that one whose assistance can alone restore the fled hours, and you have learned the incantation that will rouse that hidden power, and the sacrifice needed for its propitiation. Knowing these things, is your heart still strong and your purpose firm?" The name I had read in the wizard volume was that of the chief cosmic power antagonistic to Aforgomon. The incantation and the required offering were those of a foul demonolatry. Nevertheless, I did not hesitate, but gave resolute affirmative answer to the somber query of Atmox. Perceiving that I was inflexible, he bowed his head, trying no more to dissuade me. Then, as the flame-ruined volume had bade me to do, I defiled the altar of Aforgomon, blotting certain of its prime symbols with dust and spittle. While Atmox looked on in silence, I wounded my right arm to its deepest vein on the sharp-tipped gnomon of the dial, and letting the blood drip from zone to zone, from orb to orb on the graven agate, I made unlawful sacrifice, and intoned aloud, in the name of the lurking chaos, Xexanoth,
an abominable ritual composed by a backward repetition and jumbling of litanies sacred to the time god. Even as I chanted the incantation, it seemed that webs of shadow were woven foully athwart the suns, and the ground shook a little as if colossal demons trod the world's rim, striding stupendously from abysses beyond. The garden walls and trees wavered like a wind-blown reflection in a pool, and I grew faint with the loss of that lifeblood I had poured out in demonolatrous offering. Then, in my flesh and in my brain, I felt the intolerable racking of a vibration, like the long-drawn shock of cities riven by earthquake, and coasts crumbling before some chaotic sea, and my flesh was torn and harrowed, and my brain shuddered with the toneless discords sweeping through me from deep to deep. I faltered, and confusion gnawed at my inmost being. Dimly I heard the prompting of Atmox, and dimmer still was the sound of my own voice that made answer to Zexanoth, naming the impious necromancy which was to be effected only through its power. Madly I implored from Zexanoth, in despite of time and its ordered seasons, 1 hour of that bygone autumn which I had shared with Belthoris, and imploring this, I named no special hour, for all in memory had seemed of an equal joy and gladness. As the words ceased upon my lips, I thought that darkness fluttered in the air like a great wing, and the 4 suns went out, and my heart was stilled as if in death. Then the light returned, falling obliquely from suns mellow with full-tided autumn, and nowhere beside me was there any shadow of Atmox, and the altar of zoned agate was bloodless and undefiled. I, the lover of Belthoris, witting not of the doom and sorrow to come, stood happily with my beloved before the altar, and saw her young hands crown its ancient dial with the flowers we had plucked from the garden. Dreadful beyond all fathoming are the mysteries of time. Even I, the priest and initiate, though wise in the secret doctrines of Aforgomon, know little enough of that elusive, ineluctable process whereby the present becomes the past and the future resolves itself into the present. All men have pondered the riddles of duration and transience, have wondered, vainly, to what bourne the lost days and the sped cycles are consigned. Some have dreamed that the past abides unchanged, becoming eternity as it slips from our mortal ken. And others have deemed that time is a stairway, whose steps crumble one by one behind the climber, falling into a gulf of nothing. Howsoever this may be, I know that she who stood beside me was the Belthoris, on whom no shadow of mortality had yet descended. The hour was one newborn in a golden season, and the minutes to come were pregnant with all wonder and surprise belonging to the untried future. Taller was my beloved than the frail, unbowed lilies of the garden. In her eyes was the sapphire of moonless evenings sown with small golden stars. Her lips were strangely curved, but only blitheness and joy had gone to their shaping. She and I had been betrothed from our childhood, and the time of the marriage rites was now approaching. Our intercourse was wholly free, according to the custom of that world. Often she came to walk with me in my garden, and to decorate the altar of that god whose revolving moons and suns would soon bring the season of our felicity.
The moths that flew about us, winged with aerial cloth of gold, were no lighter than our hearts. Making blithe holiday, we fanned our frolic mood to a high flame of rapture. We were akin to the full-hued climbing flowers, the swift-darting insects, and our spirits blended and soared with the perfumes that were drawn skyward in the warm air.
Unheard by us was the loud murmuring of the mighty city of Kalud lying beyond my garden walls. For us, the many-peopled planet known as Heston no longer existed, and we dwelt alone in a universe of light, in a blossomed heaven. Exalted by love in the high harmony of those moments, we seemed to touch eternity. And even I, the priest of Aforgomon, forgot the blossom-fretting days, the system-devouring cycles. In the sublime folly of passion, I swore then that death or discord could never mar the perfect communion of our hearts. After we had wreathed the altar, I sought the rarest, the most delectable flowers. Frail curving cups of wine-washed pearl, of moony azure and white, with scrolled purple lips, and these I twined, between kisses and laughter, in the blaze maze of Belthoris's hair, saying that another shrine than that of time should receive its due offering. Tenderly, with a lover's delay, I lingered over the wreathing, and ere I had finished, there fluttered to the ground beside us a great crimson-spotted moth, whose wing had somehow been broken in its airy voyaging through the garden. And Belthoris, ever tender of heart and pitiful, turned from me and took up the moth in her hands, and some of the bright blossoms dropped from her hair unheeded. Tears welled from her deep blue eyes, and seeing that the moth was sorely hurt and would never fly again, she refused to be comforted, and no longer would she respond to my passionate wooing. I, who grieved less for the moth than she, was somewhat vexed, and between her sadness and my vexation there grew between us some tiny, temporary rift. Then, ere love had ended the misunderstanding, then, while we stood before the dread altar of time with sundered hands, with eyes averted from each other, it seemed that a shroud of darkness descended upon the garden. I heard the crash and crumbling of shattered worlds, and a black flowing of ruinous things that went past me through the darkness. The dead leaves of winter were blown about me, and there was a falling of tears or rain. Then the vernal suns came back, high-stationed in cruel splendor, and with them came the knowledge of all that had been, of Belthoris's death and my sorrow, and the madness that had led to forbidden sorcery. Vain now, like all other hours, was the resummoned hour, and doubly irredeemable was my loss. My blood dripped heavily on the dishallowed altar, my faintness grew deathly, and I saw through murky mist the face of Atmox beside me, and the face was like that of some comminatory demon. March 13th. I, John Milwarp, write this date and my name with an odd dubiety. My visionary experience under the drug Suvara ended with that rilling of my blood on the symbol dial, that glimpse of the terror-distorted face of Atmox. All this was in another world, in a life removed from the present by births and deaths without number. And yet it seems not wholly have I returned from the twice-ancient past. Memories, broken but strangely vivid and living, press upon me from the existence of which my vision was a fragment, and portions of the lore of Heston, and scraps of its history, and words from its lost language arise unbidden in my mind. Above all, my heart is still shadowed by the sorrow of Calaspa. His desperate necromancy, which would seem to others no more than a dream within a dream, is stamped as with fire on the black page of recollection. I know the awfulness of the god he had blasphemed, and the foulness of the demonolatry he had done, and the sense of guilt and despair under which he swooned. It is this that I have striven all my life to remember, this which I have been doomed to re-experience. And I fear with a great fear the further knowledge which a second experiment with the drug will reveal to me. The next entry of Milwarp's diary begins with a strange dating in English script. The 2nd day of the moon Akalat, in the 1009th year of the Red Aeon. This dating, perhaps, is repeated in the language of Heston, for directly beneath it, a line of unknown ciphers is set apart. Several lines of the subsequent text are in the alien tongue, and then, as if by an unconscious reversion, Milwarp continues the diary in English. There is no reference to another experiment with Suvara, but apparently such had been made, with a continued revival of his lost memories. What genius of the Nadir Gulf had tempted me to this thing, and had caused me to overlook the consequences? Verily, when I called up for myself and Beltherus an hour of former autumn, with all that was attendant upon the hour, that bygone interim was likewise evoked and repeated for the whole world Heston, and the 4 sons of Heston. From the full midst of spring, all men had stepped backward into autumn, keeping only the memory of things prior to the hour thus resurrected, and knowing not the events future to the hour. But returning to the present, they recalled with amazement the unnatural necromancy, and fear and bewilderment were upon them, and none could interpret the meaning.
For a brief period the dead had lived again, the fallen leaves had returned to the bough, the heavenly bodies had stood at a long-abandoned station, the flower had gone back into the seed, the plant into the root. Then, with eternal disorder set among its all cycles, time had resumed its delayed course. No movement of any cosmic body, no year or instant of the future, would be precisely as it should have been. The error and discrepancy I had wrought would bear fruit in ways innumerable. The suns would find themselves at fault, the worlds and atoms would go always a little astray from their appointed bournes.
It was of these matters that Atmox spoke, warning me after he had staunched my bleeding wound. For he too, in that relumined hour, had gone back and had lived again through a past happening. For him, the hour was one in which he had descended into the nether vaults of his house. There, standing in a many-pentacled circle, with burning of unholy incense and uttering of accursed formulae, he had called upon a malign spirit from the bowels of Hestan, and had questioned it concerning the future. But the spirit, black and voluminous as the fumes of pitch, refused to answer him directly, and pressed furiously with its clawed members against the confines of the circle. It said only, "Thou hast summoned me at thy peril. Potent are the spells thou hast used, and strong is the circle to withstand me, and I am restrained by time and space from the wreaking of my anger upon thee. But haply thou shalt summon me again, albeit in the same hour of the same autumn. And in that summoning the laws of time shall be broken, and a rift shall be made in space, and through the rift, though with some delay and divagation, I will yet win to thee." Saying no more, it prowled restlessly about the circle, and its eyes burned down upon Atmox like embers in a high-lifted sooty brazier. And ever and anon its fanged mouth was flattened on the spell-defended air, and in the end he could dismiss it only after a double repetition of the form of exorcism. As he told me this tale in the garden, Atmox trembled, and his eyes searched the narrow shadows wrought by the high suns, and he seemed to listen for the noise of some evil thing that burrowed toward him beneath the earth.
4th day of the moon Akalat. Stricken with terrors beyond those of Atmox, I kept apart in my mansion amid the city of Kalud. I was still weak with the loss of blood I had yielded to Zexanoth. My senses were full of strange shadows.
My servitors, coming and going about me, were as phantoms, and scarcely I heeded the pale fear in their eyes, or heard the dreadful things they whispered. Madness and chaos, they told me, were abroad in collude. The divinity of Aforgomon was angered. All men thought that some baleful doom impended because of that unnatural confusion which had been wrought among the hours of time. This afternoon they brought me the story of Atmox's death. In bated tones they told me how his neophytes heard a roaring as of a loosed tempest in the chamber where he sat alone with his wizard volumes and paraphernalia. Above the roaring, for a little, human screams had sounded, together with a dashing as of hurled censers and braziers, a crashing as of overthrown tables and tomes. Blood rilled from under the shut door of the chamber, and rilling it took from instant to instant the form of dire ciphers that spelled an unspeakable name. After the noises had ceased, the neophytes waited a long while ere they dared to open the door. Entering at last, they saw the floor and the walls heavily bespattered with blood, and rags of the sorcerer's raiment mingled everywhere with the sheets of his torn volumes of magic, and the shreds and manglings of his flesh strewn amid broken furniture, and his brains daubed in a horrible paste on the high ceiling. Hearing this tale, I knew that the earthly demon feared by Atmox had found him somehow, and had wreaked its wrath upon him. In ways unguessable, it had reached him through the chasm made in ordered time and space by 1 hour repeated through necromancy. And because of that lawless chasm, the magician's power and lore had utterly failed to defend him from the demon. 5th day of the moon Oculet. Atmox, I am sure, had not betrayed me, for in so doing he must have betrayed his own implicit share in my crime. Howbeit, this evening the priests came to my house ere the setting of the westernmost sun, silent, grim, with eyes averted as if from a foulness innominable. Me, their fellow, they enjoined with loath gestures to accompany them. Thus they took me from my house, and along the thoroughfares of collude toward the lowering suns. The streets were empty of all other passers, and it seemed that no man desired to meet or behold the blasphemer. Down the avenue of gnomon-shaped pillars I was led to the portals of Aforgomon's fane, those awfully gaping portals arched in the likeness of some devouring chimera's mouth. 6th day of the moon Occult. They had thrust me into an oubliette beneath the temple, dark, noisome, and soundless except for the maddening, measured drip of water beside me. There I lay, and knew not when the night passed and the morning came. Light was admitted only when my captors opened the iron door, coming to lead me before the tribunal. Thus the priests condemned me, speaking with one voice, in whose dreadful volume the tones of all were indistinguishably blended. Then the aged high priest Helpenor called aloud upon Aforgomon, offering himself as a mouthpiece to the god, and asking the god to pronounce through him the doom that was adequate for such enormities as those of which I had been judged guilty by my fellows. Instantly, it seemed, the god descended into Helpenor, and the figure of the high priest appeared to dilate prodigiously beneath his mufflings, and the accents that issued from his mouth were like thunders of the upper heaven. O Calaspa, thou hast set disorder amid all future hours and eons through this evil necromancy. Thereby, moreover, thou hast wrought thine own doom. Fettered art thou forever to the hour thus unlawfully repeated, apart from its due place in time. According to hieratic rule, thou shalt meet the death of the fiery chains, but deem not that this death is more than the symbol of thy true punishment. Thou shalt pass hereafter through other lives in Hestan, and shalt climb midway in the cycles of the world subsequent to Hestan, in time and space. But through all thine incarnations, the chaos thou hast invoked will attend thee widening, ever like a rift. And always, in all thy lives, the rift will bar thee from reunion with the soul of Beltorus. And always, though merely by an hour, thou shalt miss the love that should otherwise have been oftentimes regained. At last, when the chasm has widened overmuch, thy soul shall fare no farther in the onward cycles of incarnation. At that time it shall be given thee to remember clearly thine ancient sin, and remembering, thou shalt perish out of time. Upon the body of that latter life shall be found the charred imprint of the chains, as the final token of thy bondage. But they that knew thee will soon forget, and thou shalt belong wholly to the cycles limited for thee by thy sin.
March 29th. I write this date with infinite desperation, trying to convince myself that there is a John Milwarp who exists on Earth in the 20th century. For 2 days running, I have not taken the drug Suvara, and yet I have returned twice to that oubliette of Aforgomon's temple, in which the priest Kolaspa awaits his doom. Twice I have been immersed in its stagnant darkness, hearing the slow drip of water beside me, like a clepsydra that tells the black ages of the damned. Even as I write this at my library table, it seems that an ancient midnight plucks at the lamp. The bookcases turn to walls of oozing, nighted stone. There is no longer a table, nor one who writes, and I breathe the noisome dankness of a dungeon lying unfathomed by any sun in a lost world.
18th day of the moon Okalat. Today, for the last time, they took me from my prison. Helpinor, together with 3 others, came and led me to the adytum of the god. Far beneath the outer temple we went, through spacious crypts unknown to the common worshippers. There was no word spoken, no glance exchanged between the others and me, and it seemed that they already regarded me as one cast out from time and claimed by oblivion. We came ultimately to that sheer falling gulf in which the spirit of Aforgomon is said to dwell. Lights, feeble and far scattered, shone around it like stars on the rim of cosmic vastness, shedding no ray into the depths. There, in a seat of hewn stone, overhanging the frightful verge, I was placed by the executioners, and a ponderous chain of black, unrusted metal, stapled to the solid wrought, was wound about and about me, circling my naked body and separate limbs from head to foot. To this doom others had been condemned for heresy or impiety, though never for a sin such as mine. After the chaining of the victim, he was left for a stated interim, to ponder his crime, and haply to confront the dark divinity of Aforgomon. At length, from the abyss into which his position forced him to peer, a light would dawn, and a bolt of strange flame would leap upward, striking the many-coiled chain about him, and heating it instantly to the whiteness of candescent iron. The source and nature of the flame were mysterious, and many ascribed it to the god himself rather than to mortal agency. Even thus they have left me, and have gone away. Long since the burden of the massy links, cutting deeper and deeper into my flesh, has become an agony.
I am dizzy from gazing downward into the abyss, and yet I cannot fall. Beneath, immeasurably beneath, at recurrent intervals, I hear a hollow and solemn sound. Perhaps it is the sigh of sunken waters, of cavern-straying winds, or the respiration of one that abides in the darkness, meeting with his breath the slow minutes, the hours, the days, the ages. My terror has become heavier than the chain. My vertigo is born of a twofold gulf. Eons have passed by, and all the worlds have ebbed into nothingness, like wreckage borne on a chasm-falling stream, taking with them the lost face of Belthorus. I am poised above the gaping maw of the shadow. Somehow, in another world, an exiled phantom has written these words. A phantom who must fade utterly from time and place, even as I, the doomed priest Kalaspa. I cannot remember the name of the phantom. Beneath me, in the black depths, there is an awful brightening.
Thank you for listening. If you liked it, subscribe for more every week, and I will see you next time.